Today at the National Press Club, comedian and grand design aficionado Tim Ross. The TV and radio host has extended his passion for the built environment into a whole new career, promoting Australian architecture. Tim Ross with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. I'm Sabra Lane, I'm the club's president. I'm also the presenter of the ABC radio program AM. We're in for a special treat today. We've got self-confessed design nerd, comedian, TV presenter Tim Ross. Have I left anything out? No. Good. Tim is presenting the 2018 Griffin Lecture titled Pick a Town and Break It Down. The lecture is named in honour of Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Marnie Griffin, the designers of Canberra. If you're following this conversation online, our Twitter handle is @PressClubAUST and you can use the hashtag NPC. Everyone, please welcome Tim Ross.
Thank you, Sabra. It was wonderful. When I arrived today, someone said, "Oh, Ross, we didn't recognise you today. You look like you've dressed up for the event." And of course, over the years, I've had bigger hair, bigger beard, bigger gut. And when I was working in breakfast radio in Sydney, I had to interview Matt Damon for one of the films he was out promoting, and really nice guy, and we had a great interview. And after the interview, I was walking downstairs at the hotel where we were doing the chat. He walked down as well, and there was a coffee cart out the front. I ordered a cup of coffee, and then he ordered a cup of coffee. And when they arrived, Matt Damon paid for my cup of coffee, which was really lovely. And unbeknownst to me, this woman from the film company was watching the whole thing happening, and she went back to the office and she went, "Oh, that Matt Damon, he's such a dreamboat. Not only is he good looking, not only is he a great actor, but I just saw him buy a cup of coffee for a homeless person." My dad's watching today, turned 82 on Monday, and I rang him up to say happy birthday. And he was in Bunnings the other day, which of course is an Australian thing to do, isn't it? And when I was a kid, I used to watch my dad do a lot of the local light operatic plays. And when he was in Bunnings the other day, he saw this woman and he was sure that he recognised her from somewhere. And he went up to her and said, "Did I do Paint Your Wagon with you?" And she said, No, I didn't do Paint Your Wagon." He said, "I'm sure I did Sound of Music with you." And she went, No, I didn't. I never did Sound of Music." "I know, I did South Pacific with you." And this woman said, "Look, no, I didn't do South Pacific with you, and I've never seen you before." And then when Dad walked back, his wife was watching the whole thing happen, and she said to him, "What were you talking to Lindy Chamberlain about?" So happy birthday, Dad. I love the stories that go with architecture. It's one of the attractions for me. And my house in Sydney was a house that was built in the late 1950s, designed by a guy called Bill Baker, who's a great architect. And he was like a lot of architects who went through World War II. He ended up being a pilot in the Air Force. And after the war, because he'd learned how to fly, he was working for Qantas and as an architect at the same time. So he's multitasking well before John Travolta. And so he was flying from Sydney to Los Angeles, and he's getting sort of jazzed up on all this West Coast modernism. And he came back and he designed a house for the original owners of our house, the Athertons, in that style. And it's got a wall of glass right out the front so people can see straight into our house. So the neighbours see a lot more of us than I suppose they would like to. And over the years, we've had two lots of very famous people live two doors up from where we live. First up, we had Kate Blanchett and Andrew Upton living in the house, the rental house two doors up. And as a result, there's paparazzi out the front of our place all the time. And even though we're there and they could see straight into our house, the paparazzi never bothered to take a photo of me. And I've done a couple of crappy TV shows in my time, and I was pretty devastated about that. And then after they moved out, Delta Goodrem and Brian McFadden moved in, and some of the people in our street were pretty excited about Brian McFadden moving in because some of them hadn't lived in the same street as a complete knobhead before. I mean, he was the worst neighbour. He'd be doing burnouts and having all these parties all the time, and I'd turn into that guy, I'd be ringing up the police and I'd be going, "Oh, what are you going to do about it? Brian McFadden's having another party, you know, what are you going to do?" And they'd say, "I would like to help you, Mr. Ross, but it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon." But after years of the paparazzi out the front of my house being able to look straight into my modernist home and not taking a photo, I was devastated by this. So in the end, I stripped down to my undies and I took the wheelie bin out the front, and I'm standing there in front of this guy in his Commodore, and he didn't even bother to pick up his camera. And I said, "What are you doing, mate? This is a great photo opportunity." And he said, "That's the problem with you, Rosso, too much supply, not enough demand." What I'd really like to talk about today is about the last 60, 70 years of our architectural history and our buildings, our wonderful buildings. And as you know, we're on the development charge at the moment. We're going upwards and outwards, and I suppose it has to happen, but it doesn't have to happen. We don't have to destroy the legacy of our great buildings. And what I think is important about our buildings is that they're more than bricks and mortar. They're more than the form. These buildings of the last 60, 70 years hold our memories. They hold our history. They hold our stories. And I think in many ways, most importantly, they tell us a lot about our national identity. And I think that's what's important. And as a nation, we're a great nation of travellers. We love to see the world. And why do we go around the world? And it's something I think we're incredibly proud of, because we want to roll around in the history. We want to roll around in the past. But for some reason in this country, we don't want to roll around in our own past. We're hell-bent on destroying it. And the other day, I watched some friends of mine debating why millennials like the song by Darryl Braithwaite, The Horses. It's like they're losing their minds over it. They're going, they weren't even born when it came out. Why do they like it so much? This ridiculous conversation going on. And I couldn't see why it was so hard to understand why there's certain young people like Horses by Darryl Braithwaite. Of course, it's a great song. It's, you don't have to do much dancing to it when you're at a wedding. It's like, and that's sort of all you have to do. But the reason they like it is there's a really simple answer to that. The simple answer is because it's ours. And as naffers and daggy as it is, it's ours, and it is part of our history. And when we are dancing with our people who are 9 to 90, like we did at a recent family wedding, we're dancing to that song, we're rolling around in our own archive. And it's really strange to think about music being archive, but it's the same with our buildings. Our buildings are our archive, and we don't destroy our archive. We look after our archive and we respect it. And I think many of you could understand my attraction to architecture, particularly modernist architecture, is because many of us can relate to this idea that there was always a house more exciting or more interesting than our own down the road, that you'd look into and you'd go past it and you'd always want to go inside that house, and that's me. And for me, they were always the modernist houses, and modernism sort of loomed large when I was a kid, whether it was the Brady Bunch house or the Skippy house, or even you'd see it with the Hawaii 5-0 and those wonderful modernist apartment buildings. It loomed large, and I haven't lost that desire to go inside those houses that I saw when I was a kid. And it hasn't, like last week it was Halloween, and there's a classic example. My kids wanted to go around the corner to do, we're going around the corner to do Halloween, Dad? I went, no, get in the car, kids, we're going to Castle Crag, there's modernist houses there. So let's knock on the door. This looks like a Harry Seidler. I'd love to come in, thank you very much. But that passion remains for me, and so much is important about what happens when we're kids and what architecture can turn on in our little minds. And it's sort of apt to be here for the Griffin lecture, because for me as a kid growing up in Melbourne, suburban Mount Eliza, I was riding my bike as a kid around the Ranelagh estate that was designed by the Griffins. And I was doing all those things that kids do, riding around with my bike with my brothers, and we're flashing brown eyes at old ladies or kicking over letterboxes and doing all those mischievous things that kids did. But at the same time, in that Ranelagh estate, just like here in Canberra, there's buildings designed by our greats, the Roy Grounds, Robin Boyd, Chancellor and Patrick, Kevin Borland. Later on, we had the great project homes, architect-designed project homes, Pettit and Sevitt and Merchant Builders. And so that whole era of architecture, without me knowing as a little kid, is seeping into me. And it's like, I liken it to those great songs by Hal David and Burt Bacharach, and you wake up one day without ever owning the album and you love every one of the songs. And for me to go back in time is to see those houses as an adult and not to be able to see the things that I couldn't see when I was a kid. And it was like when my parents were having a dinner party when I was a kid, and my brothers and I would sneak downstairs because there'd be this big cacophony of laughter coming from upstairs, and Dad would be telling a bawdy joke, or someone would be choking on an after-dinner mint, or someone would be touching someone they shouldn't, at hot August nights. And we would sneak downstairs and try and open the sliding doors to see what was going on, and my parents would close the doors and usher them up again. Or as when I was a kid and we'd be sitting there watching Doctor Who or watching the goodies, and Mum would be baking a cake, and in those days, of course, you turn the Mixmaster on and make the TV go all static. The static's like, stop it, Mum, turn it off. It's like we want to make that static go away. And of course, I grew up in a time in the 1970s and 80s of incredible nationalism, and of course that seeps through. And it was a different type of nationalism, and that's the whole idea with the Darryl Braithwaite song, is those kids are trying to tap into a sort of a broader, healthier nationalism that doesn't exist today. And I describe that time in the 1970s and 80s as a time where we really liked margarine. And I know it sounds absurd, but if you think about it, for centuries we've all worked out that butter's a pretty good dish. It's great tasting, it's cream and salt and that's it. But they came around in the 1970s and they just told us that this polyunsaturated spread is better, and it's only because you can just spread it on a piece of white bread easier than you can spread butter. That was the only advantage they ever had. But how did they sell it to us? They sold it to us with nationalism. And if you remember, you ought to be congratulated. And we thought, it's the Aussiest thing you can ever do is have margarine. And we bought it up. And, and then they went on, and Eater saw that, and they went, well, let's put the flag on the front of margarine and call it Eater 5-star and get Rita the Eater to come in. And we go, yeah, no worries. And we take all that on, and that whole thing, that idea of nationalism was huge. But we saw it in our homes and we saw it in our suburbs, and particularly in the materials of those homes, where our houses, as much maligned as the brick veneer houses are, they sort of, those homes, you see it here, it has a feel of the bush. It has a feel of who we are. Because in the 1970s we were rolling around in ourselves, whether it be our TVs, our movies or our music. We found our identity, and of course in the 1980s we decided to take that to the world. And I miss those ideas of the Australianness of suburbs, where, as a kid you'd be there and someone would be backing over a Grey Nichols cricket bat, there'd be an asphalt grazed Sherrin football, and the gum trees in our gardens, and grevilleas and tanbark and kangaroo paws, and all these things that speak of who we are and a national pride that we've forgotten. Today's housing estates don't have that. Like this absurd situation in Sydney where the Western Sydney Council are trying to encourage people to plant gum trees, because they hate trees because they don't want to pick up leaves. Our houses of today where we have no trees and they just put the air conditioner up to full belt, and that's going to make us all happy. I miss that sense of who we are. And one of the reasons that happens is because of Bunnings, and Bunnings decide what plants we have in our gardens. They prescribe what it is that we're going to have. So there's a smaller choice of plants that we can have in our garden today than we could in the 1970s. And I think those memories that we have of those times are really important. And of course we're addicted to change. We're addicted to renovating everything. It's always been part of us, and going to Bunnings is part of that. And we've been doing it for a long time. In 1880, when they opened the exhibition hall in Melbourne, some obscure royal came to town, and of course we always have awnings on buildings in this country because it's hot, but because they looked old-fashioned, because they didn't look right, they didn't look European, they ripped them all off. So this obscure royal could go up from the Windsor Hotel and up to the exhibition buildings and didn't see our ugly awnings. And of course as soon as they left, they put the awnings back up again. But we can't get past that. We still do that. We're still in this desire to show the world that somehow we're always on the move. And if we see it in terms of, we're so quite proud that we're the way that we adapt to new technology, and really how much does that matter, to always make things shiny and new. I love in America and in Europe, if you want to go to a place where you went to your 10th birthday, you go to that restaurant and it looks exactly the same. I doubt very many people could go into the restaurant you went to when you were a 10-year-old. We would have changed it. Everything's got to be new all the time. And one of the strange things about it is that and I'm part of it, that Instagram generation where we're impressed by design and new design. But when you get up close to it now, it's like cowboy sets, it's like film sets. And you go a little bit further and you go, what's going on? Like, there's nothing behind this. There's no integrity to what we're doing. And it's like when you have the best meals you have is when you go around to someone's place and they put the effort into the meal and then they just plonk it down. And it's fantastic. There's consideration in that meal. And then maybe they've just put some cutlery there and they've put down a nice bottle of wine, but they haven't gone to all the fuss. As a nation, we go to all the fuss. We worry about lighting a $100 candle and having, the right tablecloths and all that sort of stuff, and we forget the main meal and we end up plating up Canton. And that's sort of how we roll, and I think there's something really sad about that. And one of my favourite suburbs in Melbourne, Beaumaris, it's got this wonderful concentration of some of the best architecture of the 1950s and 60s. And in Beaumaris, it's a bayside suburb, but 50, 60 years ago, it seemed a far long way away from the city. So the blocks were cheap, and these wonderful inventive architects and the communities that go with that designed these wonderful experimental houses. And amongst those houses were the great small home service houses where Robin Boyd and a bunch of other great architects enabled people through the age to buy architect design plans for a small amount of money. And those houses are all in there. And it's this incredible cradle of modernism. And it's been under threat because the stupid council there, who were going to bring in all these heritage studies and allow these buildings to be heritage listed, they backflipped on it. And so constantly we're seeing all these houses being knocked over. And when you knock over one of those houses, these beautiful houses from the 1950s and 60s, these inventive houses, you're not just knocking over one house. It's a part of our collective photo albums because our experience is shared. I think, and it's really hard to look after modernist houses because we all know terrace houses. I always call them they're like the cockroach of design. And they've survived everything, and we can relate to them in lots of different ways. And if you think about it, the times that you've experienced a terrace house over the years, there've been share houses, there've been restaurants, there've been doctors' surgeries. For many of you, I'm sure there've been brothels. But we accept them in all their different guises because of the strength of their design and the respect that they've been given over the years. And the same thing, we've been able to hold on to a whole bunch of California bungalows because they're really easy to renovate because there's one style of it. We all know how it happens. It goes, we're going to do exactly what Rhonda and Jeremy did at their place. We're just going to rip the back off and do this open plan section and leave the beautiful front and paint it in Federation colours. And as silly as that, me making fun of people have done that, it's been fantastic, and we've held on to those important buildings because they've been able to adapt for our modern use. But for our modernist houses, they're tougher because there's different varieties of them, and there's no one uniform way for us to hold on to them. So the challenge is for the architects is to do the best they can with those buildings and also to show them off so people can look at it and work out how they can live in them in a more effective way. When it comes to those ideas of the suburbs and tearing out the heart of the suburbs and this idea of our collective memories. Our collective memories are far more apparent sometimes than we give ourselves credit for. And I think a great example of this is a friend of mine was telling me about how his mum, who passed away, had left 4 jars of apricot jam, and she made this beautiful apricot jam, and then they were rationing it off over the years until the final spread on the toast of the final piece of their mum's apricot jam. And that's his story and his family's story, but to me that's a very Australian story, and it's one that I can relate to because that's what my mum makes, and my nana made the most amazing apricot jam. And when my brother drove his kids around to see where his grandparents used to live, they turned up and there's a wrecking ball going through it and someone was throwing the apricot tree in the skip. And we're too busy demolishing things to value that they are collective memories. And we're seeing it here in Canberra, which is such a special place. And it has the most extraordinary collection of modernist buildings. You're so lucky to have them. And what makes Canberra so great is it's where we could throw off the shackles of our colonial past and we could start afresh and we could start in our image. And those buildings need to be respected, and they're fantastic buildings. And this roll call of our greatest architects everywhere you go, it's this embarrassment of riches. And time again, I don't know, for whatever reason, there's a deeper disrespect going on that you don't care about them, or you don't see them, or you're oblivious to them. And I saw it today where the Supreme Court is. You put a building in front of one of your great modernist buildings so you can't even see it anymore. It's absolutely absurd. It's one of these nice moments. Your kid's driving along, you look out the window, you see something that inspires you. It's so important in that situation. And I think the example of why Canberra is so great, and the person who saw it the best, who's being honoured with Design Canberra this month, is Enrico Taglietti. And the thing about Enrico, he was an Italian architect, came here for a weekend and stayed, and not many people do that. And the thing is, he came here to find a site for the embassy, and he saw what could be achieved here. He could see that there was a blank canvas for his modernist ideals. And what he's created here is extraordinary. I mean, I did this tour with the Geraldine Primary School that he designed in 1975. And that's a primary school, open plan, like these Max Dupain photos of the school to die for. And then I went to it, it still looks amazing. For a period of time, the teachers hated the school, hated open plan, he wasn't welcome. And now, of course, he's loved. There's a bronze bust of him, and so whenever he's there, he puts his own hat on the bronze bust, which I just love. But when he was there, he was talking about the building, and it's the most important thing you can talk about with architecture. And he talked about the wonder of what he designed. He designed this building, this primary school, with little places for kids to hide and to find the wonder of the building. And as soon as they opened the doors, he watched all the kids find those little places. And to sit in that room 40 years later and hear students talk about how important that building was to them growing up and how important that was to their education, and with him still being there, was a fantastic moment for me in terms of loving architecture. And there's a financial side for loving your local architecture here, is that in Palm Springs, which has the greatest, I suppose, supposedly the greatest concentration of modernist buildings anywhere in the world, I think that it's actually here. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people come from all over the world to turn up for their Modernism Week, and it puts $45 million into the economy. You could be doing that here and you don't have to do anything. It's not like a flower thing where you have to plant some things. The hard work's already been done. You just have to open the doors and say, come and have a look at it. How hard is that to do? But that's just a change in thinking. People would love to come and see that and hear the stories and see these buildings and be inspired. But you may think I'm sort of this person who wants to live in some sort of modernist utopia, and it's not true. The one modernist ideal that I love is this idea that great architecture should be for everyone. But our suburbs and our cities should be like our record collections. You should have some of the new stuff, some of the old stuff, and some rubbish in between to remind us where we've come from. But unfortunately, our cities, and this one particular, looks like it's got just a little bit too much Nickelback going on at the moment. And in Sydney, because when you remove one building and you've only got one of them, that's certainly where we're at with the Sirius building, which is a really important building in Sydney, a brutalist building. It was the final high-rise building in our experiment with high-rise social housing. The government, rather than just letting something be destroyed, actively have been seeking to destroy it, which is just awful. They decimated a whole neighbourhood. They booted all the government social housing residents out, turned a whole suburb into an Airbnb suburb where people of generations had been living there. They just scattered them all over the place, and then all we got left with was people walking around with their iPhones looking for somewhere to eat. That's not the right Sydney that I want to live in. That's not the Australia that I know. And I think that the wonderful thing about Sirius is that the battle to save the building has been really, really important, and it's brought all sorts of people together. And we've been managed to talk to people about why you save buildings, because you don't save a building for today. You save a building for 50 years, for 70 years, for 100 years, because architecture's a long game. Architecture goes through all sorts of cycles. It's the longest game of all. Sometimes it might take 100 years for us to appreciate it. Sometimes we appreciate it now and then we won't like it for another 200 years. But we've at least got to give them the chance for people to come in and like them in the future. I personally loved what we did with the Sirius building in terms of getting people inside the building and around the building. And we changed people's minds about the building. They came along and they sort of went, oh, I used to think it was ugly, but now it sort of starts to make sense. And lots of people had said to me, and we played on this a lot, which was I used to go across on the train and I used to look at with my mum or my dad, and I used to see it and I was always fascinated by it. And I don't think there's anything more important than things that inspire our children. And I've really struggled with why the Treasurer of New South Wales can't understand that people are moved by architecture in that way. What is it that is going on? What is it that they're missing out on? Why isn't he that kid on the bike that saw architecture in that way? And, it's tricky, because one of the things we have as kids, or one of the things we have as human beings, is we really struggle with in life is working out why Our brothers and sisters can't see things in the same way as us. We don't have a different value system to us, even though we grew up in the same house. Until we get our head around that, it frustrates us constantly. And so to see these men, and they're always pretty much men who are my age and who see things in a different way, what is it? What's going on with these guys who want to destroy everything? What? Who says it's an eyesore, knock it down? I'd never say that. That's an awful thing to say. Oh, it's ruined, it's awful. It's ugly, knock it down. That means nothing gets a chance to breathe. And you keep thinking about what's going on in these guys' heads, and what's a deeper thing. And yes, there is a moment of dick swinging where they don't have enough money to brag at a barbecue, so I'm just going to sell off state assets because I've got something to talk about. That's part of it, but the simpler version is that there's a lot of these sort of middle-aged white guys. They go home and their daughters make them watch Married at First Sight, and they get angry, and then they get up the next day and they sell buildings. And it could be the answer. I don't know. When I was doing the series Streets of Your Town for the ABC, and we told the story of how we went from modernism to McMansionism. And one of the things we were doing, we went to Brisbane, and I was filming at this house, and they said to me the next day, I was going out for dinner before the filming, and they said to me, "Don't you get drunk before we film tomorrow?" And of course, I told my mates that my producer told me not to get drunk, and so what do they do? That got me a bit drunk. And so when I was filming at this beautiful modernist Jacoby house in Brisbane, and they said, "Give us a bit of that, some of that architectural language that you use to describe why this is important in the history of Australian modernism." And because I was a little bit hungover, I was sitting out the front, and all I could think of and all I could say was, "How tops is this joint?" And not only did they use it for the series, but they used it for the promo, and I'm like, oh no. But we don't all have the architectural language to talk about the things and the way that architecture makes us feel. And sometimes it's okay just to say, you know what, I like this building because it's cool. And I never thought that we would have to defend the Opera House, because we all know, those of us who've been at, seen a photo of it, we all know how it makes us feel. We know how important it is. And there we are. And the battle that we had for Sirius has certainly poked the bear, and that's what's happened with the Opera House. And I think the Opera House is a classic example of who we are. It's our calling card to the world. It's our symbol of modernity. And it's our way of telling the world that we are a progressive and forward-thinking people that value the arts. And we always talk about the sales being this important part of the Opera House, but they are very important. But the most important part of the Opera House is the steps, the expanse of the steps. And that says to everyone, welcome to the building, come up and touch it. You don't have to have a ticket to come in and enjoy it. And that's the thing that makes the Opera House great, and that's the thing that makes Australia great. And when our Prime Minister sees that as a billboard, it's an absolute disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace, and he's doing us and him a disservice. It is a beautiful building, and any other country in the world would die to have it. And here we are trying to defend not only the greatest piece of architecture of the 20th century, one of the greatest pieces of architecture of all time. And when it comes to this title, I'll finish up on this, which is Pick a Town and Break It Down. The title for this talk comes from my best mate, Kit Warhurst, who I do my shows with, and we've been friends for 20 plus years. And I've watched him sing this song that he wrote about his parents, who used to live in Redcliffs near Mildura in Victoria. And his parents are ABC watching Conservative voters. And a few years back, they decided, the Victorian State Government decided that they were going to put a toxic dump in their backyard. And here are these two very conservative people, and all their other friends got on the bus and they went down to Melbourne, and they got the placards out and they demonstrated against it, and they stopped the toxic waste dump from happening. And I think with all these situations, we're all sick of it. Our heritage is not for sale. Our stories are not for sale. Our history is not for sale. And if you're going to continue to destroy the things that we hold dear, we're going to see you at the ballot box. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Tim. As a Mildura girl, I thank you for putting Redcliffs on the map there. Do you worry about the legacy that's being left behind by the McMansion suburbs that are going up in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne? Every inch of those blocks is being taken up with big homes, with bathrooms, big cine rooms, connection points for all your devices. That little room for gardens. That we're becoming really insular. We're not speaking to one another. We're losing the sense of communities. And the houses themselves, let alone speaking about the architectural values. Do you worry about the legacy that we're leaving behind with those buildings?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and what they have been saying about it, you're right, is this idea that as a McMansion suburbs, we don't see people out on the streets in the same way. We're hiding ourselves away. We're finding the world a scarier place. Yeah, kids are online. I think the interesting thing about the McMansions is that they won't last in their current form. You've probably all seen those old mansions that have been turned into 4 or 5 apartments, in the city. That the same thing will happen to the McMansions. They'll turn into dual, triple locks over time, just because they'll have to, because people will have all this space that they don't use, and or they'll just keep this terrible cycle of just, it's 15 years old, let's knock it over. And so, one can only hope that they may be turned into something better, or they're reimagined in a much better way. A lot of them are built quite well. We always talk about them being badly built. Some of them are built really well, but just got terrible skins on them. A lot of the inside, some of the things that happen inside with these buildings are sort of a bit like some of the modernist buildings of the 1950s and 60s. Some of those ideas, they've just got these because it's all about show, it's all about bling. And what happens with bad design breeds bad design. So people in suburbs who only see badly designed houses aspire to other badly designed houses. And you can see that with houses without eaves. So that's a device that you can put your house as close to the fence as you possibly can. And so that's a very practical thing. But then that became a style. So you see people who've got a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere with a house without eaves, just for that reason, because they think it's decorative. It's madness.
Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Sabra. Tim Shaw from Radio 2CC.
God, good to see you,
Here
Tim.
in Canberra, 2 Tims for the price of one.
Yeah, really good to see you.
That's what we want.
Yeah.
Very contentious topic this morning in Talk Radio. The National Arboretum here in Canberra is magnificent, 250 hectares, and a great place for Canberrans and international visitors, more than 500,000 a year. The Chief Minister of the ACT is saying, let's build a hotel. Now, should buildings be built to give to that natural environment, or are we and should we be concerned that something as significant as this, and by the way, under the National Capital Authority, an amendment would be required to build this hotel on Dairy Farmers Hill? What's your message to governments that are going, more international investment, more rates, reminding you that it's a leasehold here in the ACT? Building a hotel at a place where we have beautiful trees, hopefully not next to the Margaret Whitlam Pavilion. The second question, your topic today is pick a town and break it down. Where is the Tim Ross utopia here in Australia? You've seen it and that we can emulate.
What's here? That's... Yeah, absolutely. What was the first question? Do you need one? I don't know. You tell me. I don't think so. I think you've got enough rooms here. If it's a very good hotel, perhaps. But I just think you need trees there. I mean, we're talking about something that's the long game. That area we're waiting for that to explode. And it's going to be the most amazing thing. And you'll have people come from all over the world to see that. And you probably already do. So no, we've got this similar situation happening in South Australia, in Marion, where ARM did the Marion Cultural Centre. I don't even think it's not even 20 years old. And the local council, it's got a library in it, and it's got a performing arts centre in it, and they want to knock it down, a beautiful building, award-winning building, and then replace it with a hotel, and then put the library in the hotel. Like, I don't want to take my kids to a library that's in a Ridges, ever. Not that I know it's ridges. Apologise, everyone likes ridges, but, you know. But no.
Yeah.
Canberra.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We love
Yeah, it's people love to hate Canberra in Australia. You know, the bubble. Need I talk about that? And
But I don't care about... I mean, the bubble's about... That affects a small part. The bubble is even a bubble of the bubble. So I know that doesn't really make sense, but the least interesting thing about Canberra for me is the politics, I suppose. It's truly Australian, and the example I always give is it's the best place to bring your family for a holiday because everything's free. And apart from Questacon, but you can sneak in the back way. Everything's free and amazing and inspiring for young people. And one of my cherished memories is of my kids running out the back of the National Gallery, Cole Madigan's beautiful, beautiful building. And there's Clement Meadmore's wonderful sculpture there. Here's a guy who started off making furniture with the sort of a pipe bender that plumbers use, and he ends up doing these incredible sculptures that are just lauded all over the world. And there it sits behind this beautiful building, gum trees, these monuments out of the paddock, and my kids running around that. You know, this gorgeous, wonderful chunk of Australia. You cannot beat it.
Do you have a favourite building here? Is there one standout?
Cool. It's so hard to... Look, I really like the Shine Dome by Rod Grounds. I think it's so important, and I think when we put in Streets of Your Town, I loved that people just they just responded to it because it's sort of this idea of the romance of modernism, futurism. It's like the space race, and I love seeing it pop up on Instagram now. It's just everyone gets over there, and you know, I think they're much better at people knocking on the door and wanting to have a look now, which is really good. And then you should be very proud of it.
Mr. Schubert.
Mr. Schubert from the National Press Club. Tim, thanks for a crackerjack address.
Thank you.
It was kind of like the sort of country town children's bike ride around the place of, you know, National Press Club addresses in our time, and brought back some terrific memories, including having lived in a terrace house that was once a brothel in its past. So we used to get some very interesting people knocking on the door at about 2 a.m, which was terrific. Very high class of visitor at the time. But I wondered, you've given us a whole range of things to think about and some beautiful memory pictures of slices of our past as a country. Is there a Tim Ross design doctrine? Can you distill that any further? Your big lessons for do this, don't do this when it comes to thinking about designing cities and buildings?
I think that the idea of the balance, I think people don't respond to planning very well. And I think that's one of the reasons some people struggle with Canberra. If you think about the great cities that we love, people always talk about New York. So New York's a hot mess of things, you know. It's like, and we like the frenetic energy. And no matter how good you are as an architectural planner, you can't plan for those things. We need the layers and the levels and years of things being built up. So I suppose in some ways that time's ahead of Canberra when some of the mess falls into place, and I don't know what it looks like, because I don't think if it's just a modernist utopia, it doesn't work for anyone. It's too alienating for everyone. For me, in terms of the simplicity of design, the houses that I respond to the most, and I think everyone feels most comfortable in, are the ones that are modest. And I'm not a big believer in telling people how to live or how to design, but I know what's going to make you happy, and that is living in a house that's modestly designed and small in its footprint. But you don't have to live in the perfect house. Same thing, you know. Lots of people. Same thing with Streets of Your Town. One of my favourite houses we went to was the Italian family, and you know, there's tiles everywhere, and they'd made a mess of a terrace house and put all the terrible aluminium windows in. But my God, the food was great, and there's fruit trees everywhere, and it feels like a home. And so all of those things trump everything that you walk into a house and you can smell food or coffee or kids running around, because that's ultimately what makes us whole. You can have the most beautiful house in the world, but if it's empty and doesn't have a soul, the best design's not going to help you on that one.
John Millard.
Thank you, Sabra. John Millard, Freelance and Community Radio. Thank you, Tim, very much for your most amusing address. You came from a stand-up comic background to a very successful media career. And this is not, historically, a lot of this has happened. Go back to Roy Reen, the great Beau McCarthy. And some of the great stars of, for instance, The Big Gig started at the Flying Trapeze Cafe or the Last Laugh Restaurant and Zoo or wherever it might be, as stand-up comics. But many people of ability as stand-up comics just don't have that sort of success in their careers. Do you think this is not just down to how should we put it, to talent, but to business acumen, luck, or all three, or something else?
Oh, in terms of my career, I don't actually know whether I've got an answer for you on that question. Can you just rephrase it for me? Just sorry,
I suppose what I'm trying to say is so many people of talent in stand-up comics, and when you listen to them in those sort of venues, you can hardly distinguish that they've got the same sort of ability. But so few of them have a successful career in big media. What do you think? How would you recommend to stand-up comics that they might be more successful in those careers?
I suppose for me, it's if you get out of the realm of being in stand-up rooms, and I've never been the greatest stand-up comedian in the world, so I'm probably the wrong person to, and I've never done it. I've done so many other things at the same time, but I think, I just got old and got boring and got earnest about stuff, really, and so it seems to be working out okay. Here today. Hi, Mum.
Simon Gross.
Simon Gross from Canberra IQ. What you're basically talking about is demand and supply and style. You started off with the market signal that there's not much demand for a picture of you and your underdacks with a garbage bin. You also talked about Bunnings, and you said that Bunnings decide what people buy. I think it's the other way around. Bunnings, with all their electronic systems, know what people buy, and they tell their suppliers what people want, and it goes that way.
What happens is that the nurseries only grow what Bunnings want them to grow. So that's all they do. So there's fewer markets, there's fewer nurseries around, and the fact is that there's less plants available today than there was in the 1970s, if that's what you want to put in your garden. As said, not an expert on, I tell you where the mops are, if I in row 7. But I'm not an expert, obviously, in the inner workings of Bunnings.
There's Bunnings and then there's Yarralumla Nursery, okay? Yeah. My spouse and I have renovated a house, and it's a nice, modest ex-govy, and it's really cool to live in. And we drive around, and she spumes expletives at some houses that are going up. Terrible, absolutely. The air goes red. And others, she purrs. Me, I think, okay, it's a free country. People can be stupid. People can be bogans. People can be cool. People can have style. There's demand and supply and style. So you're kind of just been extemporising in that area, but and you talked about who we are and our buildings expressing who we are. How do you, imagine educating Australian generations and perhaps their builders and architects so that they do better things when it comes to building?
Well, I think that idea of kids being around great buildings when they're a kid, when you're a kid, and whether it's school excursions, and if our civic buildings and our schools are better designed, they're always going to have a better effect on people. And not everyone, our apartments obviously need to be more interesting, need to be better designed, and I think I sort of believe that that is that idea that we can't have perfect looking suburbs. They do have to be wonky. We're always going to have ugly houses, great houses, but we need to have better houses, and we need to also think about how we're going to live. And I think we need to be thinking about multi-generational houses, and I think that's the next challenge. And not enough people are thinking about, well, we're sort of building houses for families that existed 40 years ago when kids went off to moved out of home when they were 18 because they couldn't stand their parents. Now families really like each other. It's sort of bizarre. And we're actually going back. The way that we live in terms of sort of solo families is reasonably new. You know, those stories of the 1920s and 30s where, you know, Uncle Fred slept in the sleep out. This combined families will get back to that point. And so if you're building a house today, I think where the exciting thing is how do we get a multi-generational house where your house evolves so your kids' family might be living in one section of it. We certainly know that garages are going to disappear. Many people will have driverless cars in sometime in the next, 10, 15 years. It'll come out... It'll come onto us before we know it. Not everyone will want them. Obviously, you won't. But because he just said bullshit. And that's fine. And I hope you still get to drive me around in a taxi. But the whole if we look at the way that we create houses for today in terms of how we're going to live, where our kids living there with us. Or when you downsize, you don't have to move out of your house. You're living into the granny flat, or you're moving into the carport, which is now a really lovely one-bedroom apartment, and your own family can live in your house. Or you rent that house out, and you've got your little apartment, and you can travel the world, and make your sort of lifetime investment work for you in terms of without having to downsize. Or, you know, which is really sad for people because people, you know, they get old and then they have to move away from their community. So if you've got a multi-generational house, your mum or your nana can stay in the house they've been in for 50 years, in the area that they've been in for 50 years, without having been shipped off to somewhere where they don't really want to be, that makes them anxious or sad. I think that's really important.
I don't know, have you had a chance to look at the lodge? And do you know that there's a vacant piece of land on Lake Burleigh Griffin for a new prime ministerial residence, but I don't think any party will be game enough to make the case for building a new PM's residence. If you had the choice to be able to do that, what kind of house would you build next to the lake to be sort of a modern version of the lodge?
Oh, gosh. You really put me on the spot with that one. You build the... People, this is a music analogy, right? So if the Beatles are around today, you always see these young bands go, I want to make it analogue, I want to strip everything back, you know, I want to do it like the Beatles. They only did it with 4 tracks, they managed to get all this sound. The thing is that if the Beatles were around today, they'd use every piece of technology they possibly could. So I would suggest what to do is you find a really, really good architect and get them to make the best possible house they can with the cheapest amount of money, because it's our money.
Genevieve Jacobs.
Hello, Tim. Genevieve Jacobs, Region Media. And also with my hat on as a member of the ACT's Historic Places Advisory Committee. So apposite to have you here because this is a time of roiling, boiling growth and change in Canberra. That causes a lot of anxiety for many of us. But change is, I guess, to some degree inevitable. So I want to ask you about the role of the good developer. Now, here in Canberra, we've got some developers, frankly cowboys, others for whom there's been a genuine commitment to the growth of the city. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about how developers can make a conscious contribution to the fabric of the city and its story.
Well, I think that the great example is with New Acton, and essentially, you know, like with David Walsh in Hobart with Mona, and they talk about the Mona effect and how it completely changed Hobart and Tasmania. And I think with New Acton, when Hotel opened up, suddenly people were streaming through the doors to get there and be part of it, and it changed perceptions. And so everything's there waiting to happen. But I always think what's really interesting about the New Acton precinct is there was obviously a deep sense of respect and understanding the rich architectural history of this place. And the idea that you should, because there are so many great buildings here, I think you should be competing with those buildings and trying to better them rather than trying to dumb it down. And so we see the best and we see the worst. But, you know, for those, we're always going to struggle with developers because there's always money to be made in property in this country, and there's been a lot of it. And, you know, it's we need the governments and the councils to step in. And the same reason where buildings are getting knocked down. And it's easy for me to talk about nostalgia through the eyes of, you know, a 48-year-old male. There are plenty of people in this country who don't have the same experiences, and nor should they, and nor should we expect them to sit out the front of a house and go, where's someone backing over a Grey Nichols cricket bat? But we need someone to step in and to protect those houses, to stop them and from knocking them over because they don't understand, and nor should we try and make them sit down and understand. It's just the government said, or the council said, this is a significant building and it has to stay. My view is there's certain suburbs we should be quarantining the lot. If we don't do it now, we will be crying. We'll be crying in the streets. Like, we have the most beautiful suburbs, and you know, within 10 years, if we don't stop, everyone will be looking back at the photos and just we'll be just weeping and go, what do we do? We see that we never learn. You can see it in every city in this country. You look back at the photos of the buildings we've knocked down. You go, what? How did that happen? It's really sad.
Claire Cousins.
Thank you. Great job, Tim.
Thanks.
Claire Cousins, National President, Institute of Architects. We all love Tim because he's always a fantastic advocate for the value of design and architecture. But as we all know, politicians are elected into their position to so-called represent the public voice. What do we do when we've got politicians projecting on the Opera House, proposing Apple stores in Fed Square, knocking down Anzac Hall? What's the solution?
We just keep talking about it. I mean, the obvious one, obviously, is voting them out, but can't always be done. But we do find that, I think, the more the conversation broadens, the more we're having these sorts of conversations. You know, as you know, I don't have I'm not an architect. I don't have a vested interest in these things. So it's like I can say whatever I want about it, and I come as someone who just is an enthusiast. So, and there are plenty of people out there who feel like this, and who we just need to sort of turn things on and just explain why things are important. Particularly this war on civic space. One of the things that happened with the Sirius building when we did this Friday night Sirius program, getting people to come down and have a drink. You know, there's hundreds of people there, and then 2 weeks later, they put a cyclone fence straight through a piece of public land to stop us from hanging out there. It was a supreme act of bastardry. But what we also realised from that was they were getting worried about people. And whenever you do, it's easy for them to be, they'll always be dismissive of what they think is the crazy fringes. You know, the people, the renter crowd, the placards and all that stuff. But when sane and normal people get together, that worries the bejesus out of them. Like kids' parents, people who vote for them, who are going to march against them. And there's plenty of those people out there, and we just need to get them together.
Shannon Madison.
Hi, Shannon Madison from the Mill, Architecture and Design. Firstly, I want to say thank you for all that you do to celebrate our story, often in a way that we don't seem to be able to do ourselves. But my question is, how do we get past the kind of ugly factor, or the Canberra kind of death by neglect factor? So Northbourne Precinct, where we've very quickly over the last couple of years lost some really truly wonderful pieces of architecture that were left to kind of be well beyond their prime, and got to a point where people say to me, like it's an insult, oh God, you're one of those people who actually likes the Northbourne flats. Well, yes, I am, and I like what they were and what they represent and what they really could be if we embrace them instead of bulldoze them. How do we get the wider population, I guess, to see some of that beauty when buildings aren't so shiny and new anymore?
Yeah, I mean, that's that idea of talking to them in terms of their historical importance. One of the great things about a lot of the buildings, they're very well documented in terms of photos, and those archive photos done by those great photographers like Max Dupain are so evocative, and I think they're a really good way of putting them in their original state, so you can look back and go, wow, that's cool, that's interesting, and a continual conversation about it. The one I worry about is the Churchill building by Robin Boyd, one of our greatest architects, if not our greatest. It was refused heritage listing. It's his final building, and it's amazing. And I don't understand. So am I jumping up and down about that one? The more, as I said, the more we talk about it, the more we elevate these buildings and what they mean to us, and link them with our memories. I think one of the great examples in Canberra of making something an icon out of something really normal is your bus stops. And they're an important part of you, and that's living, breathing architecture that you can touch and use and feel. And you're so linked to them because that's where you waited for your buses to go to school. It's where you had your first cigarette, you kissed someone, all those sorts of things. You hid from someone, you got bullied. And now I've seen them over the years. You see the photos of them, you see the paintings, you see the T-shirts, the tea towels. Someone's holding one up now. Like, they are part of who you are, and in a very small way, an important part of your architectural history. So if that's been able to make the jump to an unlikely Canberra icon, you just need to add the other ones to the Canberra icon, a list of Canberra icons as well.
Ken Randall.
Tim, I'd like to ask you about institutional buildings. You mentioned them more or less in passing in several parts of your address, but do you think there should be a formal process before well-established institutional buildings are changed by whatever dictate of the government of the day? And more specifically, what do you think about the redevelopment of the Australian War Memorial and Anzac Hall?
I think award-winning 17-year-old buildings by internationally recognised firms that work particularly well shouldn't be destroyed. I think it's madness. And the mind boggles. Like, it's just time, effort, consideration, great minds, a great building. So that's part of it. So, but more importantly is that finding a solution for what the problems are, and I don't know exactly. All I know is that they want to move it on to build something else, or whatever it is. The broader discussion that should be happening about the War Memorial is how, in the future, we're going to exhibit things. And we've seen this happen in Sydney with the Powerhouse Museum, where someone said, oh, it's old and it's outdated. And those comments come from people who don't use museums or cultural institutions. Because cultural institutions aren't about buildings, they're about ideas, they're about exhibitions. So, and how we exhibit things is what's important. And the basis of an exhibition place for anything is, walls and lights. And you can do that anywhere. Like, you could take, if you want somewhere, you could take an old Bunnings when Bunnings get even bigger because they decided to put more plants because of this broadcast. And you could turn that into a very good museum, and the strength of it is just the exhibitions. And so the actual discussions that are going on about how we should exhibit things or in the future has changed completely. And so rather than saying, and I don't know what they're planning, but for the $500 million or whatever it is, maybe you want to put some more tanks in there, but is that what people want to see in the future? Because we all know how we consume things in a different way. The question should be for the War Memorial is, what is the Netflix version of the way that they are going to exhibit things? And do you need to knock over a building to do that? And I think whether or not that's part of the discussion is that in 50 years' time or 40 years' time or 20 years' time, are we going to be taking our families to look at old bombers or I think it's going to be deeply unfashionable to take young people to see stories about people being killed. We're going to have to change how we do it. Or how do we spend that money in terms of putting things online? Or certainly I know that my wonderful friends at the ABC would love some of that money to make great documentaries that more people will see, more people will engage with. They're crying to tell those stories, and the mind boggles the amount of stories we could tell about Australians that would affect Australians rather than knocking over something. And of course, environmentally, you go, oh, we're going to put a 7-star building in or whatever, you lose 2 stars by knocking something over. And apart from the disrespect to the award-winning architects, and that's another whole thing where if we don't value what our people are, the time and effort that people put into these things to inspire us. You're doing it here with John Andrews. Poor old John. He's great buildings here. You're knocking off half of them. And in Canada, all his buildings are loved. World-class architect. All we're doing, he's sitting there in orange in his wheelchair, crying because we just have no respect for the wonderful buildings that he did that have made this city in particular a much better place.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Tim Ross.
Thank you very much.